On today's episode, I'll be talking about Die Hard 2, which is barely set at Christmas.
If you're looking for a man with no plans or programs, and he always needs a chance to hold hands for romance, or you're looking for the loot with an old man or cold hands, it's a creature of the night who heads for his spotlight. I'm here to welcome you to Blended and Random Reviews. No method when I choose. It's Blended and Random Reviews.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Brandon at Random Reviews, covering one unsystematically chosen topic at a time. If you like listening to a guy recap and review movies in weekly episodes, then look no further. To keep up with the newest content, you can find Brandon at Random Reviews on most major video and audio platforms, as well as all popular social media sites. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. So, like I said, today's movie is Die Hard 2, based on the novel 58 Minutes by Walter Wager, which, by the way, is not a sequel to the novel the original Die Hard was based on, which was a sequel to a different book that was made into a movie also. It's very confusing. They basically would just take books and they're like, oh yeah, this would work as a sequel to this movie. Why don't we retool it to include all of those characters and just do that as the plot of the movie? It's very weird. It's not a thing they do very much anymore. Released on July 3rd, 1990. Runtime 124 minutes. This movie is rated R by the Motion Picture Association of America. Budget $70 million, directed by Rennie Harlin, who he also directed Cliffhanger. I haven't seen that in a very long time. I know it's about like rock climbing or has a lot of rock climbing centric ideas in it. I don't remember if I really enjoyed it. From what I gather based on ratings, it's pretty mediocre, but I probably want to go back and revisit it at some point. He directed Deep Blue Sea, which has LL Cool J with the world's greatest title song. Like, he recorded a song that is just otherworldly ridiculous for this movie. It also has, I think, Samuel L. Jackson and a couple other people. I want to say the lead actress in the movie is like particularly unlikable in that, but I might be thinking of Lake Placid. I can't actually remember. And he also directed The Long Kiss Goodnight with Gina Davis and Samuel L. Jackson as well. And I don't think I've ever actually seen that movie, but from what I gather, it's actually pretty decent, and I kind of want to check it out at some point. For the writers, we have Stephen E. D'Souza and Doug Richardson. D'Souza wrote the original 48 Hours, and I believe he also wrote another 48 Hours, the sequel. And the first one is really great. I barely remember the sequel. I do remember something about maybe it like retconned something in the first movie, and it made no sense, or it was like basically it nullified events in the first movie or something. I can't remember what that was all about. He also wrote Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I fucking loved Commando as a kid. Me and my friend Brad would watch that movie, and we just thought it was so over the top awesome in every way, and we couldn't get enough of it. It was, I think it was kind of billed as like Arnold Schwarzenegger's answer to the First Blood and Rambo movies with Sylvester Stallone, but it was not really that. Like, it didn't have the same feel at all. And he also wrote the original Judge Dredd, and if you've never seen that one, definitely skip it unless you just want to watch like a pretty mediocre bad movie that is borderline comedic and just really over the top stupid. I really like the Carl Urban movie Dredd that came out in like the 2010s, and I don't know for sure what year that was, but anyway, it's really good. It's really comic book-esque, basically. It's like very like a comic book, and I really like it, and I've been dying for a sequel, but they'll probably never make one. Richardson wrote the original Bad Boys with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, and that one is okay as like a standalone or like an action movie by itself. but it's also pretty stupid, like writing wise. So I don't know that I want to give him too much credit. He also wrote Money Train, which I think has Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson. And it never occurred to me that that's like a reunion movie for them from White Men Can't Jump. It didn't even cross my mind. But I've never seen that one. I don't really know if it's any good at all. He also wrote Welcome to Mooseport, which I've never seen, but is supposedly notoriously bad. It has Ray Romano, and it's also Gene Hackman's last acting role before he retired. So that's really something. For the composer, we have Michael Kamen. He did the score for this movie. He also did Lethal Weapon, which I covered a few episodes ago. And honestly, the Lethal Weapon score was questionable, but that was more because of the saxophone elements that I didn't really care for, but it wasn't like a terrible score. He also did The Three Musketeers from 1993 with, I think it's Chris O'Donnell, Kiefer Sutherland, and Oliver Platt, but I cannot remember who the other guy is in that movie. It is going to bug me and I'm going to have to look it up later. But anyway, I can't even remember if that movie was good, but there were a lot of up and coming or established popular young actors in it, so it was like very well regarded in its time, but I'd like to go back and see if it's actually any good, because I am like positive that Chris O'Donnell cannot do an accent, so I somehow doubt it's like gonna hold up from that standpoint. And he also did the music for Mr. Holland's Opus, which is an all-time favorite of mine. I really fucking love Mr. Holland's Opus, so I can't really complain. For the cast, we have Bruce Willis, who plays John McClane, of course, and he was also in The Sixth Sense. I covered that a little earlier this season, and that one's really fucking great. It is basically M. Night Shyamalan's shining achievement. It's fucking great. I love it. He also did The Whole Nine Yards, and I haven't seen this in I don't know exactly what year it came out. It's been at least 20 years since I've seen it, but it's like half comedy, half like action movie. It's about like hitmen or something, and I'd love to go back to it and watch it again because I think it could still be good. It was pretty amusing at the time. And he also was in Sin City. He played Hardigan in that, and Sin City is a series of graphic novels by Frank Miller. I covered it in my first season, and I really fucking love Sin City. It's so well done. It's so very much emulating the graphic novels it's based on, and I fucking adore it. Bonnie Bedelia plays Holly Gennaro McClane, and she was, of course, in the first Die Hard movie. And she was also in something called Presumed Innocent, which I've heard of, but I absolutely have no idea what it's about, or I've definitely never seen it. And she was in Heart Like a Wheel. And when I see actors or actresses that are listed in these movies that are in too big of roles to not include in the cast, I have to go to IMDb and just use their top 4 most well known for movies to kind of give myself an idea of what I should put for these lists. William Atherton plays Richard Dick Thornburg, and he was, of course, in the first Ghostbusters movie. He was the guy that made them shut off all of their equipment that basically was where they kept all of the ghosts that they had busted, and basically just created chaos and set up the final act of the movie, basically. And he always plays an asshole and everything. He was also in Real Genius, which I don't think I've ever seen, and I think that's the one with Val Kilmer, and I'd kind of like to go back and see if that one's decent. Or it's always weird to watch movies like that because you really should see them at a certain age, and I'm probably too old for it now, but I would like to check it out again. And he was also in something called The Day of the Locust, and I have no fucking idea what that is. Reginald Vell Johnson plays Sergeant Al Powell, and of course he was in the first Die Hard, and he was also on a TV show called Family Matters for several seasons. I don't know how many years it ran, but that show was very popular in that it had a character named Steve Urkel, and he had his pants hiked up, and they were he had cuffs on the bottom of his pants, and he had suspenders and glasses, and he was like the uber nerd basically, and he had all these catchphrases, especially like "Did I do that?" And it was it was iconic 90s stuff, but it is ridiculous to look back on and think, oh god, why did that get really popular? And he was also in Ghostbusters in a very small role. I think he worked in the jail like as a guard or for a police officer. And by the way, he always plays a fucking police officer in almost everything I've ever seen him in, especially the stuff he's really well known for. Then we have William Sadler, who plays U.S. Army Colonel William Stewart. He was in The Shawshank Redemption, and honestly, every time I watch The Shawshank Redemption, I always think he's going to turn out to be a bad guy because I saw Die Hard 2 before I saw The Shawshank Redemption, and I always just associate him with this movie. So I'm like expecting during that movie for him to turn out to be this bad guy, but he's not. And honestly, he's pretty fucking good in that movie. He was also in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which I've always heard is just pretty mediocre and it's nowhere near as good as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the first movie. He was also in The Mist, which if you ever come across this movie and you think based on like the synopsis or the cover that it might be a kind of movie you'd like to watch, I would highly recommend watching it at least. It is a very crazy movie. It's a very watchable movie, I will say. A lot of people don't like some things about it, and I won't spoil anything, but it is at least worth seeing because it's pretty fucking wild. And then last but not least, we have John Amos or Amos. I don't know if it's Amos or Amos, but he plays Major Grant in this movie, and he was in Coming to America. He managed the McDowell's that Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall's characters go to work at. McDowell's is a knockoff McDonald's, and he is the father of the woman that Eddie Murphy's character falls for in the movie. And I honestly love the original Coming to America. I never watched the Legacy sequel that came out a couple years ago. Didn't really seem like it'd be worth it. And he was also more famously on the show Good Times, and I want to say that was 70s. It had to have been in the 70s. I've never seen an episode of it, and I think it's just because it was before my time. I probably will never watch it. It's like a number of other shows from before I was alive that are it's just not something I'm ever going to go back and watch. For casting notes, there's obviously not much because, well, it's a sequel and a lot of the major casting had already been decided before this movie was even into production. But Bruce Willis was paid $7.5 million to reprise his role as John McClane. Franco Nero, who plays General Esperanza, was cast after producer Joel Silver saw movie posters that featured him hanging in the office of their mutual accountant. See, I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel for these things, but he saw him in movie posters at his accountant's office, and it happened to also be Franco Nero's accountant's office. So anyway, for the plot synopsis, John McClane must race against time to save hundreds of lives, including his wife's, when a group of terrorists take control of the Washington, D.C. Dulles Airport's systems and threaten to crash several planes if their demands are not met. For the tagline, Die Harder. This was so frequently prominently used as a tagline that most people just think it's a subtitle for this movie. Like they think it's Die Hard 2 : Die Harder, but it's really just called Die Hard 2, and Die Harder was so prominent in all the posters and stuff that everybody just thinks that's the title. Alright guys, let's just dive right into the plot of this motherfucking movie. So this movie kicks off with a very loud and aggressive title card, but I do appreciate that it does get right down to business. John McClane, who is of course played by Bruce Willis, comes out to intervene as his car is being towed. He tells the officer to just put the car down nice and easy, and the cop who is orchestrating the towing says he'll put it down at the impound. It's made pretty clear John was parked illegally, but he tries to use some sob story about how he was there to meet his wife as she was getting off a plane because they're at the airport. But already this annoys me because he of all people should respect a no parking zone as a cop himself. And also, it's not like this was a sudden and unexpected trip to the airport for John. He should have really had a plan to park in a conventional location, especially at a fucking airport, which is honestly one of those places that you never push your luck with because they have to nip that shit in the bud quickly. They can't just fucking let you get away with it because it would happen all the fucking time with as many people are coming and going, and it would just be chaos. You know, it's just crazy. John tries to get chummy with this cop and tells him he can't tow it because it's his mother-in-law's car, and she already doesn't like him because he's not a dentist, and John shares that he's a cop with the LAPD, which also serves as exposition because he was still NYPD in the first movie, but his wife had moved to LA. He shares this whole thing with the officer as well, and the guy does not budge and still writes John the ticket and tows the car. And honestly, I appreciate this officer because he can't let people get away with shit like this, and he has to be strict about it. And even though you might be thinking, oh, well, couldn't he just ticket him and put the car down and let him have it? But honestly, he needs to fucking make him pay not only the fine, but have the full inconvenience of getting towed because you can't do this shit. Like, you cannot fucking park where you're not supposed to. But I do want to point this out as early as I can. I really only rewatched the first Die Hard movie. I've seen this one a couple of times before this viewing, and I've seen the third one maybe a few more times than that. And I think I've only seen the fourth and fifth one once a piece, despite liking the fourth one way fucking better than most people seem to. But I will say that the thing I always remember about this movie that I was never a fan of is how referential it is to the first movie. It's very sequely in that way, and it's something that all sequels should avoid if they can. And obviously, I'll point it out as it happens throughout this movie because it happens way too much to just gloss over. John frustratedly ends up stranded without his vehicle outside of this airport that he said was in Washington, D.C., and it's at Dulles Airport. A page comes through on his beeper, and for those of you who are too young to know what a beeper is, it was a small electronic telecommunication device that was about the size of, I don't know, a deck of cards, and usually clipped somewhere around your waist. Typically, what you would do is call a person's beeper, which is also known as a pager, and then you could usually enter the phone number you wanted the person receiving the page to call when it came through. My parents both had them in the 90s, I think for work. I don't think they had them like their own personal pagers. I think they just had work-issued ones. And it seems like, at least with theirs, it wasn't until late in the game that there might have been some capabilities added where you could go to a website and send like text, like letters instead of just numbers. Of course, as cell phones became more commonplace among normal people who weren't filthy fucking rich, beepers fell out of popularity and were only used by people in certain professions like on-call doctors before texting became more of a thing. So John goes back to rushing through the airport, and we get a few shots that include Christmas trees, but honestly, this movie references Christmas far less than the first one as well. It's not like there's a lot in the first movie where they talk about Christmas or there are Christmassy things being said or going on that just don't happen in this movie much. And oh boy, because it's 1990, he walks up to a help desk of some sort and asks the woman where the telephones are, and she directs him to a bank of payphones nearby. It pans over to a television set that's showing a news broadcast where they're talking about this General Ramon Esperanza, who is being extradited from the Republic of Valverde to the United States, which is not a real country, by the way, and it's supposed to be in Central America. They use the news broadcast as a way to transition from the airport where John is to where a man named Colonel William Stewart is watching it in what I guess is his home or wherever it is he's staying. There's not very much in this place, so it might just be his interior decorating style, or he might just be there temporarily. An important thing to note about Stewart is he is not only watching this broadcast, but is also doing some kind of weird Tai Chi type exercises in front of a mirror. Oh, and I probably should also mention that he is completely naked while doing this. The big thing that the viewer can ascertain is that Stewart is a bit of a psychopath, most likely, but he is in great shape to his credit. And I want to be clear, we don't see like frontal nudity. We see his ass and we can just tell he is completely naked, but we see him from behind. He does a few more exercises before suddenly grabbing his remote and turning off the TV, but I guess we're to gather that he has some kind of personal stake in this General Esperanza guy getting extradited. It cuts back to John getting another page, and there is no available payphone because literally every single one of them is being used since no one has cell phones yet. Then it cuts back, and suddenly Stewart and a group of men who are militaristic looking are marching down some hallway, and they all get into an elevator together, but it's not really clear yet where they are, and you can only kind of assume that they're either in the airport or very close by. It cuts back to John, who has finally found a payphone and calls his wife, Holly, while she is still on a plane, and he asks her kind of jokingly if she's landed yet, and she of course knows he's got to be joking because she's calling while on the plane, and if she would have already landed, she probably wouldn't have bothered to call him and would have just found him at the gate. And she says a line that must have dated this movie almost immediately after it was released, which is, "Honey, it's the 90s, remember? Microchips, microwaves, faxes, and airphones." And John responds by saying, "Well, as far as I'm concerned, progress peaked with frozen pizza," which is really a pretty low bar to set for progress, if I'm being completely honest, because most frozen pizza is not that good, and if it's even decent, it's usually grossly overpriced. I'm looking at you, DiGiorno. And this is a very sweet back and forth between the two of them, by the way. The short story about what happened in the first movie was she had moved to Los Angeles for work before the events of that movie, but John had stayed back in New York because he was a cop and he had a bunch of cases that he needed to finish up on before he moved. And basically, they were on the brink of divorce before that movie happened, and those events kind of brought them back together. But their first interaction in the original movie was very tense. It was tense and it almost immediately turned into an argument. So this is actually kind of nice and sweet. But just a little spoiler alert for the remaining 3 movies in this franchise following this one, and I'm just pulling on memory here. I want to say she is not even in the third one at all, and there might be some throwaway line in it about how they finally broke up or parted ways, and I think that one's actually set in New York City. She explains to him that she's going to be about a half an hour late in landing, and John suggests that maybe the two of them leave the kids with their parents, or with her parents, and get a hotel together and get some alone time. She agrees with this and they end their little call. It cuts back to Holly, and the woman next to her on the plane talks to her about how wonderful she thinks technology is. Holly explains that her husband doesn't agree, but the lady says to her that she used to have to carry mace around wherever she went to protect herself, but she pulls a stun gun out of her purse and explains that she now carries this instead, which in my mind is not the best alternative because it's heavier and I believe it requires batteries, and you have to legitimately be close enough to someone to press it into them to use it and incapacitate them temporarily. If you guys don't know what I'm talking about, it's like those little handheld devices with the prongs on the end, and like if you push the button, it like does electric shocks through the prongs. You're supposed to press it into somebody to like temporarily knock them out or whatever it does. And it was like really popular or becoming popular at this time. But I guess to be fair, I want to clarify, mace does have its drawbacks as well, because I mean, even though you're doing something to incapacitate somebody with mace, they still have the strength, and if you're close enough by, they can still fuck you up because the rest of their bodily functions are still presumably working. The lady says that she tried the stun gun on her dog and the poor thing limped for a week, and it seems like this whole interaction is pretty awkward for Holly. And I gotta say, don't fucking test shit like that on your fucking pets. What is wrong with people? But then it cuts back to John at the airport, and he randomly bumps into Colonel Stewart, of all people, who is walking through the airport, and John tells him he looks familiar. To clarify, Colonel Stewart was the guy exercising naked while watching TV a little bit ago, but Stewart says he gets that a lot and he has been on TV before, so a lot of people do recognize him. Nothing more comes of their little interaction, but Stewart looks back with a concerned expression as John walks away. It cuts to a small snow-covered church somewhere, and there's a white unmarked van pulling up in front of it. 2 men get out of the van who are dressed in orange with orange hard hats on, and they begin knocking on the door of the church, An older man who is inside watching TV, clearly not expecting anyone, is annoyed to have to get up to answer the door. And these guys, they made themselves out to look like they're working for the power company. Like you wouldn't probably question it if they told you they worked for the power company. And I'll be honest with you, immediately the two of these men are explaining to the guy when he answers the door that they have something to check with the conduit on his property, you just never doubt for a second that they're just going to kill this guy momentarily. Like he reluctantly lets them in so they can check out their equipment on his property somewhere, and he makes idle conversation with them for a few seconds, and then one of the guys just shoots the old man without any fucking warning, and this old man is now laying dead on the floor, and the two of them shut off the TV and radio back to the rest of their team and let them know that the church is ready. Presumably, they plan to use this church as some kind of bad guy base for whatever their devious little plot is. It cuts back to the airport where three of Stewart's men are sitting at some kind of eatery discussing what the weather will be like in the coming hours around the area when General Esperanza will arrive. It's established that the three of them intend to continue with whatever plans they have, and basically they all synchronize their watches or something, and it shows John also happens to be sitting nearby to this eatery but is completely oblivious to there being anything that's going on initially, as he smokes a cigarette inside without any repercussions. And I do find it really weird to think about the fact that right after I turned 21, I was still able to smoke in bars and restaurants if I wanted to for a while, almost 2 years. But they banned it in Michigan in May of 2010, which doesn't seem that long ago. But I was never a smoker at that point, and I would only do it for the novelty of being able to at certain places. I even remember one of my smoker friends adamantly refused to believe that there would ever be a day where you couldn't smoke in a bar. But he was probably just in denial because it even seemed inevitable before then, as many places had gone smokeless over time. Like you were seeing fewer and fewer places that allowed you to smoke inside. It shows that John is looking around now and seems to be developing some amount of awareness of the fact that something suspicious is going down nearby at the airport. He approaches two uniformed police officers at the bar with the intention of notifying them of this suspicious thing he saw, but it turns out one of the officers is the guy who towed his car at the beginning of the movie, and so the guy immediately has an attitude with John and is unwilling to talk to him in good faith and take what he has to say seriously. But also, the officer is played by Robert Costanzo, so it's totally fair to instinctively not fucking side with him. And this might be a hot take, but even though you're supposed to be on John's side, of course, early on, this officer that he butts heads with has every right to be annoyed with John and think that he's a dipshit, which I did touch on earlier a little bit. It shows a news crew covering General Esperanza's story, interviewing officials in the airport, and they spot Colonel Stewart walking through. They attempt to talk to him, but he shuts them down and actually tells them to fuck off, and he's just a complete dick to the reporter and her camera guy. It shows John walking through the crowds and following a suspicious man who ends up walking into a back room, but it looks like it locks behind him, and it's just basically like when it closes, it's just one of those automatically locking doors. John flags down an airport worker who is nearby and flashes his badge and has the guy unlock the door and tells him to notify airport police that something is going on. John makes his way into the back room, and it's one of those areas where the luggage is being transported on conveyors to the different areas, and he looks over and he can see two bad guys that we saw near him at the eatery earlier, and they claim to work there, and when he asks them for some ID, they hesitate for a moment, and they just pull their guns and begin firing at him. They enter into a bit of a cat and mouse game as they exchange fire occasionally while under the cover of all the conveyance equipment in the area. Eventually, John manages to spray one of the two men in the eyes with an aerosol can, but the can is shot out of his hand by the other guy, and I don't know if we're supposed to believe that the guy was actually aiming for the can and didn't just shoot John with what must have been a very clear shot, But regardless, that moment is still a bit iffy to me. And I want to explain something now because with the first three movies, I have never come across anyone who doesn't rank Die Hard 2 last when comparing it to the other two of the first three. And to be fair, with it being the second movie, the deck was kind of stacked against it because expectations were going to be so high. And I want to be clear, I don't even dislike this movie. I actually do enjoy it, but there were just some weird choices that were made that were a little silly, and this whole scene in this back room showcases a lot of them. Like this weird moment where this guy who just shot the can out of John's hand is up on a catwalk, or I'm sorry, I said that really weird, where this guy who just shot the can out of John's hand, he's up on a catwalk and trying to figure out where John went. And suddenly, John jumps down on him, wailing like Tarzan in slow motion, and it really just feels corny and poorly executed and weird. Eventually, John wrestles with the guy on a conveyor belt and somehow manages to kill him by crushing him in a piece of equipment that I don't really understand the purpose of. But suffice it to say, we are to accept that this is how John was able to kill this guy and get away from him. But the guy who got the stuff sprayed in his eyes appears to be completely fucking fine now and is looking for John as well. But he overhears airport police entering the back room and attempts to flee, but John has just hopped on a bicycle somehow and crashes into the guy. But ultimately, the guy manages to get away and the police arrive and draw their guns on John. But then when he tells him that he's a good guy, he realizes he lost his badge in the scuffle. It cuts back to Holly on her phone, and one Richard Dick Thornburg is talking to two female flight attendants. Thornburg is a television reporter who, in the first movie, was covering the situation at Nakatomi Plaza. Like, he broke the story. It was like he was listening to the police radio and realized something was going on. And he managed to figure out the identities of John and Holly, and he then proceeded to locate their home address and go there to interview their young children after threatening their nanny with a call to immigration. This was particularly dangerous because the terrorists in that movie would not have been above locating John's family and killing any or all of them without hesitation had they survived the events of the movie. And also, I want to say it kind of blew John's cover because he was trying to hide the fact that he was married to Holly. He didn't want people to know that and then be able to use that against him. So he just tried to say that he was invited there by mistake and it was just by happenstance he was there. But basically, it's like that was, if I recall correctly, that was another thing that kind of got blown up. At the end of the movie, Holly and John run into this Dick Thornburg, and Holly punches him for his tasteless and compromising actions by, that endangered her and her family. These two flight attendants are very annoyed with Thornburg as well and mention a couple of these exposés that Thornburg did on their industry that painted airlines and flight attendants in a negative light. So both of these women are at wit's end with having to deal with this guy because he's like asking him, he's like having to be moved to a different seat for whatever reason. And so they hate his guts. And then when they go to put him in a new seat, he realizes that Holly is there and tells them that he can't sit next to her because of a restraining order he has against her. But I don't necessarily buy that this fucking reporter would have gotten an actual restraining order against Holly. Generally speaking, I was under the impression that restraining orders were intended for those who had demonstrated great risk of repeat offenses of violence with a higher likelihood of further interaction with their victims. But I already have way too many notes on this movie, so I'm not going to really dwell too much on my thoughts regarding how ridiculous this is as a small side plot element in this movie, let alone the fact that this Los Angeles reporter just happened to be on the exact same plane going to Washington, D.C. as Holly is, with no explanation. Like, there's no reason. I mean, I guess you could be going there for the General Esperanza thing, but you're fucking showing up pretty late for that. Back with John at the baggage area, he's expressing frustration over them allowing the press to enter the crime scene and demands that police take him to their captain. Back at the church, the bad guys have finally assembled there, including Colonel Stewart. The bad guy from the baggage area who got away shows up to explain to the colonel that although they accomplished their mission, the other guy died because someone interrupted them. The colonel holds a pistol to the guy's forehead and pulls the trigger to reveal that there's no bullet in the chamber, and he explains that if the guy fails him again, there will be a bullet in there next time. And Stewart's probably just going to get a bad review on, like Glassdoor or whatever it's called for, not being a great employer. But I'm sure it's a really healthy work environment otherwise. John arrives at the police station to meet with the captain. And of course, the captain is a complete prick, played by Dennis Franz of NYPD Blue fame. The captain chastises John for what he did at the airport and how many laws he broke and regulations he violated. John is frustrated, as he obviously was not just being reckless by discharging his firearm, and is frustrated by the lack of professional courtesy on the part of the police department. He explains to the captain that the crime scene is contaminated now and it should have been taped off, but the captain asserts that it's not so easy to just tape off a very busy airport during the holidays. The captain is convinced that the men in the baggage area were just stealing luggage and were not posing some huge threat to security. But John explains that the porcelain guns that they were using to get through security at the airport are incredibly expensive and would not be used by small-time crooks stealing luggage. The captain explains that he knows all about John and what happened with him at Nakatomi Plaza, and that he basically just doesn't give a shit about John's theories. The captain eventually tells John he needs to get the fuck out of there, and on the way out, John says the most perplexing line that is supposed to sound badass, which is, "What sets off the metal detectors first? The lead in your ass or the shit in your brains?" And I guess it kind of sounds cool if you don't think about it at all, but why would shit set off a metal detector? Like, is he eating a lot of iron or something? I don't understand. As John walks toward the exit of the police station in frustration, he gets an idea and heads over and snags an ink pad off someone's desk. And I guess even though they yell at him, they also don't come after him and say, "Hey, what the fuck are you doing with my ink pad? I need that." He goes over and stops the coroners who are hauling the bad guy's dead body out, and John convinces them that they have a new procedure for FAA DOAs where they have to get the body's fingerprints before they go to the morgue where they would ordinarily take them. And I just realized it's been quite a long time since I've seen this movie, and I've only seen it a couple of times ever, like I said. So there's a lot of stuff that I've forgotten about completely, including this, but I really hope that I'm not going to believe that somehow John is going to be able to do anything worthwhile with those fingerprints in the short amount of time that he has. It cuts to a shot of the plane that is carrying General Esperanza, and suddenly the two fighter jets that are escorting them just randomly break off from formation without any explanation. But naturally, this is all part of the bad guy's plans, and we see the general on the plane starting to do his part with being able to get out of his restraints eventually, and then he fires up a smoke. Colonel Stewart begins gearing up for his part of the plan, but I want to be clear, this is not a criticism, but you really don't have any idea what their actual plans are because you're being deliberately kept in suspense about them. It cuts to John calling Sergeant Al Powell, who was his only LAPD ally, on the outside of the Nakatomi Plaza during the first movie. The two of them chit-chat a bit like old friends, and John explains that he's stuck at the airport waiting for Holly, and then John gets the fax number for Al's station so he can send him a copy of the fingerprints, I guess. And Al makes a huge deal out of John being willing to utilize a fax machine because it's so high tech, and John obviously he normally hates tech, and he sounds like a real browbeating guy about this, and I would probably have to tell him to fuck off if I had to listen to him talk about how much he hates technology like that. John asks Al to run the prints through all the databases and fax him the results when he gets them. I'm not sure if we're just supposed to assume that John and Al work at the same precinct now that John lives in LA, or if they've just been keeping in touch because they now live so close together, because obviously LA is a very big area and there are a lot of precincts. They could both work for the LAPD, but he doesn't necessarily work in the same precinct, department, location, whatever with John. Al asks John if he's pissing in somebody's pool, and John confusingly says, "Yeah, and I'm all out of chlorine." Honestly, I don't usually say this very much about the movies I cover because I usually only cover movies that I completely adore in almost every way and are minimally flawed. But the writing in this movie seems to be the common denominator in all of the scenes that I've seen so far that are dumb or questionable, because I was desperately trying to rack my brain before I watched this again and figure out why, when so many people talk about these first three movies, this is always dead last for them. And I can tell you, some of this dialogue is legitimately not good and seems like it's written by somebody who doesn't have like very good sensibilities with a movie like this and doesn't understand how to write these kind of action movie lines. And I also know they had Bruce Willis ad lib in this movie a lot more than they were originally, or they did in the first movie, I should say. But these particularly bad ones don't seem like ones he would have been able to ad lib, or at least not have a written line for a response. You know, it's like he's being said, or something is being said to him, and he has to have a response to it. He can't just like not have a line written. But I guess maybe they do just leave it and say, "Oh, John," or like Bruce just makes up a line. It cuts to the control tower at the airport where a guy named Trudeau, who is played by Fred Thompson, is talking about the weather coming in the area. And I know I've seen Fred Thompson in other things, and there were movies in his filmography that I've definitely seen before, but nothing really jumped out as something I actually remembered him being in. It wasn't like anything was like, oh yeah, that's why I know this guy's face is because of that movie. And I'm sorry for continuing to so sorry, let me go back. I missed a step. So Trudeau and a guy named Barnes, who is played by Art Evans, discuss the kind of storm that they're likely to see within the next couple of hours. And obviously things don't look good, and there will be limited visibility expected. And I'm sorry for continuing to divert from my normal recap discussion, but this is another issue with this movie. There is way too much shit going on. It's like that classic thing where everyone wants a sequel to one up the original, but it's also not hard to overdo that. And I'm not saying that you can't make the adverse weather be a factor in the plot, but it just seems like they keep tacking on issues and things to remember to the point that it all feels so convoluted and unnecessary. Al gets back with John, and it's revealed that the man's fingerprints came back as someone who'd been dead for 2 years, so something is fishy that is going on, basically. After the woman at the counter, who helped John send his fax, asks him if he wants to go grab a drink when she gets done with work, he points to his wedding ring and smiles and walks away. The reporter from earlier that Stewart told to fuck off when she approached him sees John and walks over to talk to him. I'm probably going to reintroduce her later, but this woman's name is Samantha Coleman, and she actually ended up being in this movie more than I remembered, so I wanted to be clear. Her name is Samantha Coleman. She remembers him from the Nakatomi incident 2 years ago, which I'm sure was a big incident, but it seems like a stretch that she'd recognize him and is annoyingly, unnecessarily referential to the first movie about this. He clearly doesn't want to talk to her and makes his way up to the control tower where Captain Lorenzo is meeting with Trudeau. John interjects, and despite the captain's objections to him being there, Trudeau humors him and John shows him the info about the fingerprints. Trudeau reacts with a serious face but doesn't say anything before it cuts to Colonel Stewart in his giant command center at the church. He's gearing up to do something, and based on the equipment there, it seems like he's probably going to hack into the control tower equipment at the airport, and it cuts back to the tower, and Trudeau is asking what John's theory is, but he doesn't really have one yet. But he just knows that it's professionals planning something big with the general arriving, who is a giant drug lord. Lorenzo mocks John's lack of certainty because he's basically the exact same character as Chief Robinson in the first one. Paul Gleason plays this Dwayne T. Robinson police chief, and basically it's like he doesn't want to believe anything John has to say, doesn't want to take his opinion on anything, he doesn't like him and all this shit, and basically this is the same guy, but it's just being branded as somebody else. And it's basically like this guy is expecting John to know somehow what the entire plan of this terrorist is, and it seems like he refuses to believe anything is going on if that information can't be provided to him immediately in full by John. But essentially the struggle is that although John knows something must be happening, he can't really do much about it until he knows what their plans are and things actually start happening. Then Trudeau instructs the captain to get more men on this case because he's starting to buy into what John's saying. There's some commotion, and they point out that the lights on the runway are going out systematically and that someone is controlling them from an unknown remote location outside of the tower. And they have to go into their emergency procedures because obviously if any planes are trying to land in the next few seconds, they won't be able to see the runway in this weather. And it shows the bad guys outside of the church cutting the conduit lines that are buried, and I just feel like they wouldn't ever have designed anything this way, but it is what it is. And this is my frustration because there are so many notes that I already had for this movie, and I was a little more than a quarter of a way into it, and I already had like more than half the notes I would need for an entire episode to have like a normal runtime of a little over an hour. Trudeau gets on the intercom and announces a code red and tells everyone to divert all air traffic outside of their landing zone to other airports. And then I guess basically nobody that is within their zone will, or everybody that is within their zone will remain in a holding pattern for the time being. Trudeau explains to McLean and Lorenzo that this will buy them a couple of hours to investigate the situation, and he just doesn't want to panic the 15,000 plus people that are there at the airport on the ground for the holidays and all this stuff. Trudeau asks John if this is what he expected to happen, and John says no, but he knows that it's just the beginning. Colonel Stewart calls and they put him on speaker, and he announces to the entire tower that now that he has disabled a large portion of their necessary communication devices at the tower, he believes he has their attention. He refuses to reveal his identity to them and says that it's not relevant, but he makes it clear that if they don't do as he wishes, it's likely that planes will begin to run out of fuel in the air. He makes it clear that his plan is to isolate the general's plane and have it land without being met by anyone, especially authorities. And he also wants them to provide a 747 fully fueled that I guess they can load their crew of terrorists onto with the general to escape the airport and not have the general go into custody in the US. So I asked so at this point, I don't know if it was like I was too caught up with note taking, and I started Googling, like, what the fuck is the deal? And basically, like, I'm just a fucking moron. Because it's like, I was trying to think, I'm like, well, why couldn't they just send the planes that are circling to the other airports in the area? Because there are actually a lot of airports in this area. I mean, there's another DC airport, the Ronald Reagan Airport, but there's also a airport in Baltimore, which is pretty close, and all these other things. So it's like I was like trying to rack my brain, but they actually establish that because like they establish within the movie that they have cut off the tower's communication to the planes. And so Stewart's command center at the church base is actually the only one that can directly talk to these planes. And when the planes communicate back, it only goes, or the tower can hear them, but they can only really interact with Stewart, and they don't realize that Stewart isn't legit. And so they have no reason to believe that there's any reason that they need to not follow his direction, basically. The colonel goes on to state that the airport must comply within 2 minutes to his demands, and if they attempt to reestablish or repair their communication systems, the terrorists will retaliate for it in some severe way. Lorenzo seems to believe that the colonel is bluffing, but they can't really take a risk by trying to call him on it. John gets into an argument with Lorenzo because obviously if he had listened to John earlier, they might have prevented this whole situation. And now Holly is in one of these planes circling the airport and her life is at risk. Lorenzo demands that security take John away because he's not authorized to be up there. As the guards are beginning to restrain John and take him away, Barnes is discussing with the two of the controller people that there's a separate radio tower, like a secondary tower on the airport property that is isolated from the rest of the communication systems, and it was like recently built and is still kind of under construction, but it does work. Suddenly, as John is getting very hostile and he's being taken away, that blonde reporter Samantha Coleman from earlier suddenly has just made her way up to the control tower as well, and she asks all of them about some situation that is rumored to be developing. This angers Lorenzo, of course, and he sends the two of them away, John and Samantha, and I just kind of wonder how so fucking many people are getting into this control tower unhindered, even if they don't realize there's an emergency situation. It's not a secret that you're not supposed to go into these areas, and there should be guards that are watching these entrances and stuff. It seems like someone would have gotten the police/guards on higher alert than normal, at least, to ensure that no one could just waltz into any old area now that this terrorist situation is happening too. Like, I know it's like there's a chance that didn't already happen and they didn't already notify them, but still. but I'm a bit of an idealist like that. I just kind of feel like that's kind of how they should have fucking handled it. So the guards force John and Coleman into the elevator by themselves for some reason and don't even ensure that they're properly escorted away. So, of course, Coleman is trying to get a story out of John, or at least some kind of quote or information of some sort. And John stops the elevator with the emergency stop and begins opening up the ceiling to escape, because why wouldn't the police have allowed for him to do that? As Coleman is begging him for some kind of information to go on, he tells her to fuck off, and she makes the comment that she already got that from Colonel Stewart earlier when she saw him at the airport. This gives John the realization that although he couldn't place the Colonel at the time when he ran into him, it now all kind of makes sense that the Colonel is behind the sabotages. John manages to sneak out of the ceiling, and it's just in time for Coleman to arrive at her destination floor, and the officers who greet her ask her where the other one of them is, and she says he was just claustrophobic, I guess, and she leaves the elevator, and the two of them walk inside and look around and up at the ceiling even, and don't seem to find anything, and it's just like, oh, well, I guess we'll just wash our hands of this situation. Barnes explains his idea with using the new radio tower to Trudeau and Lorenzo, and he explains that even the planes won't know the difference of where the communication is coming from. Trudeau has Barnes get to work on preparing the other tower, but Lorenzo reminds him that whatever they can think of, the bad guys can also think of, so they need to be on high alert, which is actually a good point. It cuts to John, who is remarking about how he's in another dark basement and he's dealing with another elevator, and it seems like it's pretty weird that the same thing is happening to the same guy twice. But what's funny is it's not really that similar. I mean, they're obviously trying to force it to be similar, but a lot of this is not what it's all about. Like, it's just not that similar to the events of the first movie. And that's probably honestly why this movie doesn't work as well for most people who are fans of the first and third movies, because in the first movie, John is completely on his own, and not only that, he's isolated from everyone else completely by happenstance. But this movie wants to recreate all of those original elements without the real feeling of isolation on the part of John's character, which is what made the first one so interesting. And what people like about the third one so much better than this one is that they completely abandoned rehashing that plot again, and they tell a completely different story and add a tremendous supporting character in Samuel L. Jackson's Zeus. And honestly, a lot of people like Die Hard 3, Die Hard with a Vengeance better than the first movie even. And I don't know if I would necessarily say that. I honestly probably like both movies equally. They're just so different from each other, honestly. They don't even feel like they're part of the same series so much. John hears music playing, Christmas music to be clear, and makes his way through the dark hallway in the basement over to a collection of Christmas trinkets and a record player where the music is coming from. He goes to pull the needle off the record, and someone puts their hand on his shoulder, and he turns around and pulls a gun on whoever it is, but it turns out it's just Marvin the janitor, and that's all his stuff, and he just thought John was messing with it or trying to steal it. And it cuts to Trudeau informing all of the pilots of the planes circling the airport that they are to remain in their holding pattern and await further instruction. Suddenly, all of the statuses of the planes that people are waiting for in the airport begin to switch to delayed, and there is noticeable unrest with people in the waiting areas. It cuts back to Marvin showing John a map of the facility, and he locates the skywalk that Barnes was referring to where the other radio tower is, and John, of course, suggests that it looks like a great place for an ambush, and then he asks Marvin what the fastest way is to get him out there. Then we see John entering into some kind of ventilation shaft with the intent to make his way to the radio tower unnoticed. It cuts to Barnes being escorted by heavily armed guards or police officers, and as they're moving up an escalator, a man hits the emergency shutoff upstairs and stops the escalator completely from moving. But it's not just any man, it's a pre-Terminator 2 Robert Patrick, and of course, he's one of the bad guys. They start hassling Robert Patrick about having shut off the escalator, and Robert Patrick just immediately shoots one of the security guards in the head, and all hell breaks loose. But I have legitimately no idea how many bad guys there are supposed to be in addition to Robert Patrick. There are about like 6 police officers, guards, whatever you want to call them. But basically, Barnes just ducks for cover and hides out while the shooting goes on. And when he thinks it's over and it's really quiet, he slowly peeks around the corner to see if the coast is clear. But Robert Patrick walks up to him and puts a gun to his head and conveniently hesitates just long enough for John to knock a vent cover down onto him and distract him. And I'm honestly so confused about what's going on right now, because even in that moment, it seemed like only Robert Patrick was left, but I guess there were more guards and bad guys that were still alive or something, because it's definitely not just the two of them shooting at each other with Barnes there. So all of these men are having a shootout, and there's a bunch of construction equipment around here, like scaffolding and paint supplies and stuff. John manages to tip over the scaffolding that one of the bad guys is on top of, and the guy falls off of it, and then the scaffolding lands on him and presumably kills him. But one of the planks that was supported by this scaffolding ends up falling on John because he tipped the scaffolding over, and it causes him to drop his gun onto one of those moving walkways that's not turned on. And finally, it's down to one of the guards remaining, or I think it's a guard. I don't honestly know if it's a bad guy or a guard. And the guy runs out of bullets and sees John, and he's pinned under this plank, and he begins to approach John. Naturally, John manages to turn on the walkway and convey the gun toward him, and he manages to grab it and shoot the guard just in time. And so, to my shock, despite the odds, John does manage to survive this whole encounter, like less than an hour into the movie, of course. John collapses, and Barnes comes over to help him get the plank off his back, and as soon as he makes sure Barnes is okay, explosives go off in the nearby tower. And so now the entire secondary radio tower is destroyed, and John points out that Captain Lorenzo used all of his best men to escort Barnes there and wasted a bunch of time that they didn't have, even though it's not like Captain Lorenzo shouldn't have sent an escort with Barnes there, and it's not like he really could have known for sure that that was a bad idea or what was really going to happen. Up on Holly's plane, Thornburg gets pretty close to her so he can look out of her window, and he notices how many planes are in the air nearby, and some are clearly not landing, and none of them are landing at all, and it's the same way on their plane. And I love that they like establish that there's this snowstorm, but they keep forgetting that there's a snowstorm, and they shouldn't be able to see, because you like look out the window and you can see another plane out the window very clearly, and there's no snow, but there's supposed to be like a whiteout blizzard going on. Of course, Holly points out to Thornburg that he's closer than the 50 yards dictated by their restraining order. Thornburg talks about having a gift for noticing things that other people otherwise might not, and that he uses that gift to keep the people informed. She explains to him that his cause was not as noble as he's making it out to be when he endangered her and her children. Back at the secondary tower, a new group of officers is investigating the scene, and John pulls a radio off one of the bad guys, and someone at their base and the church is asking for a status update, and they don't really know what's happened, obviously. Barnes points out that they can't even listen to their radio chatter because their frequency is scrambled and it requires a code. Plus, with the number of digits, it could be one of a million numbers, and they really don't have time to try and hack it. Meanwhile, Stewart realizes what has happened and comes over the intercom at the main tower and tells them that they failed to follow instructions and will now pay the penalty for it. John comes over the radio and asks him if the 5 dead officers at the secondary tower wasn't penalty enough. Of course, this angers Lorenzo, and he presses the intercom button and says, "McLean, you stay out of this." But Trudeau cuts off his communication before he can say any more, even though he already revealed that John is John McClane. And of course, immediately Colonel Stewart is like, "Oh, you mean John McClane, the hero from the Nakatomi Tower incident 2 years ago? Social security number, blah, blah, blah." It's like he fucking knows. He knows this guy immediately. And I'm like, I just don't buy that so many people would remember that incident that well and know John by name immediately, especially because even in this era before the flow of news was constant and endless, and you could actually kind of remember individual events that had happened before better, this is still pretty fucking crazy to actually remember that well. But they try and explain away this this ridiculous memory everyone has by pointing out that John was on magazine covers and was interviewed on national news shows after it happened. John argues back with him that he is a traitor and he suggests that killing police officers is not reasonable and asks him what's next, a neutron bomb? The colonel replies by saying no, he thinks there's something they can find that's in between those two options, and he proceeds to alter the navigation on one of the planes circling the airport. He tells his man to put them on a course for 200 feet below the Potomac River. Then the colonel reaches out to the plane in question, and of course, the plane just thinks that it's the control tower, so they don't question it, and they're relieved to finally get out of the air with as little fuel as they actually have left. Of course, it's very heavy-handed as they show a flight attendant comforting passengers on the plane that they're going to be landing safely in a few minutes and blah, blah, blah. And it's just like they're really fucking milking the emotion of this, of like everyone getting their hopes up. John grabs a couple of metal poles and he rips some big pieces of drop cloth and grabs a container of flammable liquid, and Barnes helps lower John down onto the ground from this tower with a drop cloth, and John runs off into the dark snow-covered runway in hopes of using a makeshift torch to signal the aircraft of how much closer the ground is than they're expecting it to be. So naturally, the control tower can only frustratedly listen but not respond back as the plane attempts to do a blind landing based on Stewart's false guidance while believing they're 200 feet higher in the air than they actually are. And even though John was able to light the torches and wave them back and forth, there was obviously no way he could know where exactly they would land, and they don't end up seeing him in time anyway. And when the runway comes into view for them, it's already too late and the plane crashes down and then immediately explodes. And I actually do like the fact that they don't do some cop-out thing where this tragic incident is somehow avoided last second, because that would feel pretty fucking cheap. Stewart comes back on the radio to tell the control tower that if their 747 jet is ready and Esperanza's plane can land unmolested, then there will be no additional penalties. Trudeau finds Barnes afterwards and demands that he figure out a way to be able to communicate with the planes in the air to warn them about the situation, and he just tells Barnes that he has to figure out what needs to be done to make it happen. Then Trudeau goes over and sees John sitting somberly on some stairs because he's really fucking upset, and tells him he knows how he must feel and that they're bringing in an anti-terrorism task force from the army. He also explains that Holly's plane is still in the air and broadcasting their status, despite the fact that the control tower can obviously not communicate with them and that they only have 90 minutes worth of fuel left. It shows Holly having a nice back and forth with Thornburg on the plane, and then it cuts back to the church base where one of the bad guys is explaining to the colonel that the good guys have done everything that they expected them to do so far, and it drives me insane as they look over to the TV and Coleman is reporting at the scene of the crash of the airplane, and she's explaining that there are multiple aircrafts that are visible from where she's standing, and I just don't buy that if it's supposed to be a whiteout that she can actually see them. It just conflicts with the whole low visibility thing for me. It just doesn't make sense. So it shows Thornburg going and finding one of his crew members who is also on the plane and asking him to pull out one of his radio receivers from his carry-on, and he asks him to tune it to the cockpit frequency to see what actually is going on. And although the crew member confirms that he has put the device to the right frequency, he can't actually hear anything, and Thornburg realizes that given all of the other circumstances, something clearly must be going on and it's not good. We see a couple of military helicopters landing at the airport. One Major Grant introduces himself to a few of the officers on the ground, and Grant is of course played by John Amos. John complains to Grant about the fact that he only brought one platoon with him and asks him if Colonel Stewart is one of his men, but Grant says not anymore and they're here to take him down. As Grant and his men, along with the police officers, including Lorenzo, head off to get started, John stops Trudeau and asks him if he thinks things just got better or worse now that Grant is there. Back at the control tower, Barnes realizes that there is an emergency beacon on a separate frequency that only beeps to notify planes when they are over it or near the airport, basically. But he suggests that it doesn't have to only beep and that they could take over that frequency and use it to communicate with the planes without the bad guys being any the wiser. I know I'm just piling this on at this point, but I've already established my frustrations with a lot of the nonsense that I have to suspend my disbelief with in this movie. But I just don't buy that these guys would have let John be involved in any of this willingly. Like any of these discussions, they would have most likely already shut him out of being anywhere near them or part of this at all. But to be fair, as John talks to one of the guys from Grant's team who explains to him that Grant is better than anyone at this stuff, Grant's team walks through and gets on an elevator and tells John no civilians before they prevent him from boarding the elevator with them. Suddenly, Barnes manages to get through on the frequency beacon or on the emergency beacon frequency and informs the pilots of the situation. And Thornburg's guys, like with the radio device, manages to find that frequency somehow and lets Thornburg listen to what Barnes says. And of course, he knows that this is a big deal. Barnes is very careful to notify the pilots not to reply or acknowledge on their frequency because it will tip off the terrorists. It cuts to John tracking down Marvin again, and they try and find a map so John can get in with all of the officials so he can hear this briefing or discussion or whatever. As John is looking at the map, trying to figure out a way to get in there, he realizes that there is a radio that had the code entered into it under the map, and he can hear the chatter of the terrorists who are at the church base. Stewart radios into the tower and informs them that he is lighting up one of the runways and that they are not to attempt to land any planes there. Stewart radios to the general's plane that they are free to land on the lit runway, and it shows the general strangling what I guess I am to believe is like the only guy guarding him on this plane. Am I to believe that there are two pilots, the general, and a single guy guarding this drug lord who is being extradited? Just as the pilots are explaining that Stewart's instructions conflict with the plans that they were given originally, the general comes up behind and pulls a gun on the pilot and tells him to proceed as he was instructed by Stewart. In the ensuing struggle, the general shoots both of the pilots after some resistance and takes over landing the plane. John is listening in as the general radios the church base to tell them that he has lost cabin pressure and has to land on the first available runway immediately. John begins rushing around the basement tunnels, listening to the colonel, trying to determine which runway would be best, while John uses the map to try and get to whichever runway it will be in time. John finally makes his way up top as the general is attempting to land the plane, and John has to push open a grate that is preventing him from getting out, and he has to like shoot a lock off of it. And of course, where he's emerging is right in the path of the plane, and it comes down to the wire with him trying to get out from under the grate in time before one of the wheels hits him and kills him. And I just want to be clear, I don't know that much about aviation, but it is a remarkably short distance between the plane making contact with the ground and when the plane comes to a complete stop. It feels like it's like, I don't know, a 16th of a mile or something. Like it's nothing. And usually that's a very long thing, especially in icy conditions and a depressurized cabin. Then, just as the general emerges and declares that he has reached freedom, John appears and knocks him down back into the plane. And he delivers some cheesy line about remaining seated until the plane reaches the terminal. The general asks him who he is, and he just says he's a cop and he's one of the good guys. And he unnecessarily points out that the general is one of the bad guys. Then, inexplicably, Stewart and the bad guys show up in their vehicles and open fire on John, seemingly ignoring the risk of accidentally shooting the general, which is seemingly the last thing they would ever risk. But they manage to get the general off the plane somehow while John ends up still stuck on there, and they begin firing at the plane and proceed to throw at least 4 grenades through the broken windows of the plane. And luckily, for John, these terrorists opted to use grenades with the world's longest fuses on them, and that affords him the time to get into a chair and buckle himself in before pulling an ejector seat lever just in the nick of time before all of the grenades explode. So then the explosion serves as perfect cover so that the terrorists don't know that John managed to survive. It shows Thornburg using the phone on the plane to call his news station to attempt to break the story about the terrorists. and it cuts back to McLean recovering from having taken a gunshot wound to the shoulder after having made it back to the room of the airport again. Captain Lorenzo explains to him that they don't even know how many men the terrorists actually have, so he's not exactly excited about what John has to say. And then Grant storms in and tells John that they appreciate his efforts, but they don't need a loose cannon running around and potentially risking the terrorists forcing another plane crash. But John explains to them that that's no longer possible because they obviously aren't still wherever it was that they were using as a command center since they were just out on the runway, and they are not likely to return there again because they have what they want and they were fleeing. Even though that doesn't actually, I don't know if I misinterpreted that in the moment, but that doesn't actually end up being correct at all. John walks away and Barnes flags him down to tell him that if the terrorists were able to arrive at the runway so soon, that must mean they have stationed themselves somewhere very close by. Barnes shows John on a map the location of the infamous church that he knows to be close by and that would be ideal as a spot for the terrorists to go. It cuts to Holly, who is getting increasingly nervous, and she actually asks a flight attendant about if they have enough fuel to keep circling like this if the flight was originally only supposed to be 5.5 hours, and the flight attendant just tells her that they always plan for little holdups like this, which actually apparently is true. I had to Google it because although they don't have a full tank of fuel for every single flight because of the added weight, they do still carry reserve amounts of fuel for emergencies and such. It cuts back to John, who is inexplicably with Barnes, and they have actually found the church. I realize he probably needs Barnes for his expertise in the communication systems, but also, hasn't Barnes been pretty integral to problem solving at the tower, and wouldn't people probably notice he was gone pretty quickly? They see a man outside that John determines must be a guard patrolling the property because he's walking over his own footsteps in the snow, and just as John goes to make his stealthy approach to the church, the silence is broken by Holly sending him a page on his beeper. Suddenly, the guard jumps and on John's back, and there's this big struggle, which prompts Barnes to just call back to the tower on his cell phone. He alerts Captain Lorenzo that he's with John at this church, and as Lorenzo is writing down the address, Grant immediately comes up and takes the sheet from him and announces that they have a positive ID on the location of Stewart. When Grant and his men board a transport truck, he announces to all of them that they have a situation, and all of the men inexplicably swap out the magazines in their rifles with ones that have blue tape around them. It cuts back to John, who is still wrestling around with the bad guy in the snow, and there's a big standoff with the guy holding a large knife, and John is having to hold back the guy's arm so the guy doesn't stab him with it. Then John gets the guy off of him long enough to reach up and grab an icicle off the church, and he proceeds to stab the guy in his fucking eyeball and promptly kill him. And I have to say, as a guy who lost his left eye years ago, I now always notice which eye it is if someone loses or is missing an eye in a movie, and it's almost always their left eye, like mine. Nick Fury, Snake Plissken from the Escape from New York movies, Rooster Cogburn, Dr. Dre in the California Love music video, you name it, almost all of them are missing their left eye with very few exceptions. Grant and Lorenzo approach with all their men, and Lorenzo begins yelling at John again for being so reckless, and Grant cuts him off to tell him to shut the fuck up and do something useful for once. The men move to invade the church base, and all of the terrorists go into high alert as their tripwires are hit and they know that somebody's around. So they all gear up with their weapons, and they also put magazines in their weapons with blue tape around them, just like the military did. Then all of a sudden the two groups begin firing at each other, and it's important to note that they break out the windows of the church before starting to fire, and then Colonel Stewart rigs some kind of an explosive on the communication equipment before the terrorists leave the church and board snowmobiles outside. And I guess we're supposed to assume that the army would move in on this church while not only not being sure of how many terrorists were inside, but also while not even having it completely covered on all sides, especially at the exits. And of course, that will make sense eventually, but anyway. As all of them flee, John sees them, and when one of them crashes after John shoots one of them, it's pretty clear it's that he's going to grab the unmanned snowmobile and go after them. Grant and his men, along with Barnes, go inside the church, and Barnes sees all of the equipment and is tempted to land the planes with it, but Grant stops him because he knows that it all could be rigged to explode if it's used in any way. Then they do realize that there is C4 rigged to the machines, like they actually find it, and Grant orders everyone to leave the premises. On their way out, Lorenzo asks where the hell McLean is, and it cuts to John on the snowmobile, landing on whatever frozen body of water is there as water splashes up where it's not fully frozen. And let me just tell you, my sister and her husband have lived in DC or the DC area for quite a long time, and they rarely get big snowstorms with any major accumulation. And there have been times where small amounts of snow there have been known to shut the city down almost completely. And a few times they've actually gotten a significant enough amount of snow accumulation, like over a foot. And they said it was like a snowpocalypse because no one knows how to drive in the snow there as well as they do in the Midwest, for instance. And many people just abandoned their cars on the freeways and stuff and other roadways when things came to a standstill and they couldn't go anywhere anyway. And they're also not prepared for it, so they don't have like a bunch of snowplows or salt to dispatch or whatever. And I can just say it does not sound like it ever gets anywhere near cold enough in that region for any body of water to freeze over thick enough at all to ever rationalize going out on the ice, and especially not actually taking a snowmobile on it, of all things, to the point that I can't even understand how these terrorists could have anticipated enough snow and low temperatures to plan for having a bank of snowmobiles to get away on. Of course, John is desperately trying to catch up to them, and they eventually get far enough ahead to stop and turn around to face John, and then they swap the clips in their guns again for some reason. They open fire on John, and it's always remarkable how much I am supposed to believe terrorists with military backgrounds are such bad marksmen, and John fires back at them, but he also doesn't hit them. Eventually, John hits a jump, and they shoot his snowmobile as he flies over a semi, and his snowmobile explodes, but luckily, John just, tumbles down into the snow on the other side of the road and is seemingly without any major injuries. The colonel decides John surely must be dead, and I guess they don't have enough time to confirm the kill, so they just take off again. It shows John frustratedly going over to his gun, muttering about how he's positive he had the bad guys in his sights and he just still didn't hit them. And he checks the clip in his gun and realizes that the bullets in the magazine are blanks. Colonel Stewart radios to the tower to confirm that they have his 747 ready, and then they tell him that it is ready in the most remote hangar they have. He tells them to have a group of men there to confirm that it's ready, and Grant interrupts him on the radio to tell him that they're not going to have potential hostages there ready for him to take, so he can just confirm his own fucking complaint, and he's being all tough with him. Stewart, of course, recognizes Grant's voice because, as was mentioned, they served with each other, and it cuts to Thornburg hiding out in a bathroom, talking to his news station, and they're skeptical about the story he's trying to break because there's like no word of it anywhere. He plays the recording of Barnes warning the planes about the situation, and of course, the news station snaps into action. Then it cuts back to Grant on his military truck, and the men are talking, and they refer to something that happened in Grenada, and one of them men says that he wishes he could have been there. Grant says he wishes he could have been there too because then he wouldn't have to do this, and he just pulls out a knife and cuts this fucking guy's throat. So of course, the one thing I could remember about this movie that I was trying so hard not to spoil prematurely is that Grant is in cahoots with Stewart from the beginning, and this moment with him slitting this guy's throat is how it's revealed to the audience, even though I don't necessarily buy that they would have included somebody on this team that wasn't already in their plans, but whatever. Grant checks in with the colonel to confirm that things are proceeding as planned. Then it cuts to John tumbling into the basement where Marvin is again, and of course it's like John's in pretty bad shape now. He's been roughed up quite a bit. The news decides to show a live broadcast with Thornburg using the airplane phone and breaking the story about the terrorists for the public to hear. He even plays the recording of Barnes explaining the situation. Then it cuts to John arriving back to the room at the airport where Captain Lorenzo is, and this turns into the most unrealistic and over the top moment. It's like John is trying to explain to Lorenzo that he knows Grant is working with the colonel and that they'll be getting on the plane with the terrorists as opposed to attempting to stop the plane from taking off like Lorenzo thinks and pretty much everyone else thinks. But of course, Lorenzo says that's not possible because if they were working together, they wouldn't have risked a shootout at the church with each other. But because John can see that he's not getting through to Lorenzo, he pushes him back and begins firing the automatic machine gun that he pulled off one of the guys shooting at the church, and he opens fire in this crowded room directly at Lorenzo and reveals that all the bullets are blanks. And so now we as viewers understand why they were swapping those magazines and they had blue tape around them, which is because those were the ones with the blanks that were to be used to not harm their own people, aka the terrorists. And also, that's why they didn't do a good job covering all of the sides of the church and let them escape, is because that was all part of the plan. Finally, Lorenzo realizes it's time to act and has to believe John. So he goes over the intercom and tells all of his men to get ready in full body armor. And like the whole thing with John shooting this automatic gun in this crowded room, it's like, yeah, it's effective in like demonstrating that something is happening, but like it is so not something an actual cop would do. And that's the kind of thing that would only ever happen in a movie. Like, no matter how frustrated someone might be, they're not going to just fucking fire a machine gun like that in a crowded room, even if they know it's blanks in the gun. It cuts to the various people, including Trudeau, reacting to the fact that Thornburg's broadcast is creating a panic in the airport and everyone's fucking fleeing. And actually, they paid plenty of extras to make this look like it was really a crowded airport. And it wasn't like there were like, 20 fucking people just running around or something. It was like a lot of fucking people. And then it shows Holly on the plane where they're conveniently showing the news, and she puts in her headphones to hear that Thornburg is clearly hiding somewhere and sharing the story by phone because she can hear his voice and it shows that it's him. I'm not saying that this is impossible. Like, I guess I don't fly that much, and I didn't fly that much when I was that young. So like, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure most planes are not usually equipped to broadcast the news live, because that's why they usually have like mediocre fucking shitty movies playing, is because they can just have those on tape or whatever and just play them, and it doesn't really fucking hurt anything. And it's just like they don't have to worry about getting the extra equipment to be able to broadcast something. But I could be completely off base and wrong about that, and I certainly wouldn't put it past this movie though to like throw something like that in, regardless of how unrealistic it might be. John gets in the cop car with Lorenzo, who reveals that his brother in the back seat is the officer from the beginning who was towing John's car. Unfortunately, Lorenzo isn't able to go anywhere because there's so much chaos with the people fleeing this airport that he can't even really maneuver on the roads around the airport. And it cuts back to the airplane where Holly opens the door to find Thornburg proudly doing his broadcast through the phone, and she just hits him with that lady's stun gun from the beginning, and he just collapses. And of course, because Thornburg's first name is Dick, this movie has taken several opportunities to use that for comedy, as Holly calls him Dick repeatedly and deliberately. And it reminds me of that joke, how do you get Dick from Richard? And the answer is you just ask him nicely. But also, I would never name a child Richard for the same reason, but if I happened to be named Richard, I would never go by Dick voluntarily. And so we're down to the final 20 minutes of runtime, which means probably we have less than 15 minutes left of the actual movie. And we're gearing up for the showdown at this airplane hangar as the doors open and we see the giant 747. John is forced to find other means to get there since Lorenzo can't drive his cruiser through the crowds. Grant greets Stewart and the general. They're outside of the jet and they basically are already celebrating this apparent victory. And so now John is on a helicopter with Samantha Coleman, the reporter, who he called in a favor from so he could get out there. Like, he flagged her down when he realized Lorenzo couldn't get through. And unfortunately, by the time John arrives there and he's still in the helicopter. The 747 is already out on the runway, and he wants the news helicopter to just plop down in front of the giant fucking moving jet to stop it. And naturally, the pilot of this helicopter explains to John that he's not going to play chicken with the 200-ton jet, which is actually a fair response because John knew that was an idiotic suggestion anyway. Now Holly's plane is almost out of fuel, and their pilots are going to attempt an emergency landing because they have no other choice. The new helicopter is still following the jet, or the news helicopter is still following the jet, and John opens the door to the helicopter, and I guess his plan is to have the helicopter lower him down near the wing of this 747 while it's moving, and that's just smart thinking. There's nothing risky about that. John jumps down and lands on the wing successfully somehow and wedges a coat or something into one of the flaps on the wing. The general is piloting the plane and realizes that there's an issue with the wing and realizes that it's John out there meddling in their plans again. So he sends Stewart and Grant to go outside onto the wing to stop whatever John is doing because they can't take off, even though it's like, yeah, I'm sure the first people he sends are like his number 2 and number 3 guys and doesn't send like any of his lower ranking officers. But like, as I said, they can't take off, so they know they have to do something. And luckily for everyone involved, it's pretty common knowledge that most airplanes spend several minutes on the runway before taking off. So this all makes total sense time-wise. As John and Grant fight with each other in the struggle, and basically Stewart is just hanging out at the door, Grant ends up sliding down in front of the wing and eventually just falls into the turbine and dies. But of course, Stewart then comes out and begins wrestling with John. And honestly, I do love John McClane, but based on what I know of the two of these guys, it does seem like Stewart would beat the ever-loving shit out of John, which is seemingly what happens. But at one point, John notices that there's some kind of port on the front of the wing, and then Stewart gets him dangling from the front of it, and John manages to open the port just before Stewart kicks him down, and John goes tumbling to the ground, again completely uninjured. Suddenly, the port begins hemorrhaging fuel, and I guess I'm to believe the colonel doesn't actually notice this somehow and just goes to remove the coat that John wedged in the flap of the wing, and then he just heads right back inside. And remarkably, the general, who is supposed to be keeping an eye on the gauges, also doesn't notice that they're losing a ton of fuel. And you might be thinking, Brandon, are you exaggerating a little bit? If the fuel is just leaking, then it wouldn't be that obvious that they were running out of fuel. But no, I'm telling you, the fuel is just gushing out of this fucking port. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if they're losing like a gallon a second or more. So I'm not really overselling this, I don't think. Then John, who is laying on the ground, sparks his lighter and says, "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker," and hits the trail of fuel on the ground with the flame. "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker" is what he says in the first movie, and it's kind of like this recurring gag. And of course, the flame follows all the way and catches up to the jet and causes the 747 to explode, and it kills all of the terrorists on board, of course. John laughs and cheers and yells out that he lit the way on the runway for Holly with the flame, which is just another aggressively convenient occurrence. Everyone at the control tower, including Trudeau and Barnes, are overjoyed as the first plane lands, using the trail of flames as a guide, and others begin to follow suit. And like I said, I'm no aviation expert, but I am positive there is pretty much no way that it would be a bad idea for several planes to land on the exact same stretch of runway within a few seconds of each other with limited visibility. And I'm also positive that all of these planes would have been in perfect position to be able to land in such rapid succession as well. The first plane, Holly's plane, deploys their emergency inflatable slide thing, and all the passengers begin getting off the plane one at a time. The news helicopter lands and can hear John hollering Holly's name. Holly sees John and rushes down to embrace him lovingly. The news crew looks over and sees the nice interaction between John and Holly, and Coleman decides that it's much too nice to report on, so she just covers the cameraman's lens with her hand. John and Holly cross paths with Marvin, who exclaims that he's not going to clean up this mess, and laughs, which is great because I was really hoping to get some closure from Marvin's character. Then coincidentally, Captain Lorenzo pulls up in his cruiser and steps out and sees John and asks him if he got a ticket in front of his airport earlier that day, and John reluctantly replies yes, but Lorenzo just declares that it's Christmas and he tears up the ticket happily as John and Holly hop on a cart to be taken away. And the song Let It Snow plays, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the exact same song that plays at the end of the first movie. And we roll credits. All right, so trivia for this movie. In the first Die Hard from 1988, John McClane only had a few scripted one-liners. However, Bruce Willis ad-libbed many one-liners in the movie, and audiences liked them so much that in Die Hard 2 and Die Hard with a Vengeance, more gags were added, and Willis was told he could ad-lib as much as he saw fit. And it really shows through that these weren't written lines and that he was just making them up because they ended up pretty bad, in my opinion. The general is from Valverde, the fictitious Latin American country used in Commando from 1985, which was also written by Stephen E. D'Souza. God, I fucking loved that movie so much. I really probably need to cover it eventually on this. The scenes with Bruce Willis running through tunnels under the airport were filmed at a water treatment facility near Los Angeles. The facility has miles of underground tunnels and was also used in Live Free or Die Hard from 2007, which is the fourth movie, doubling as the Woodlawn Social Security Administration building. Denver was unseasonably snowless during the shooting of the snowstorm scenes, and a fair amount of snow had to be created artificially. The scene where McClane climbs the ladder from the service tunnels up onto the runway and then nearly gets run over by Esperanza's plane and has to open that grate was filmed from 6 different locations for some reason. Granada Hills, California. I don't know if I think it's Granada. Los Angeles, California. Mojave Desert, California. Alpena, Michigan. Hey, I've been there. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Hey, I've been there. And Denver, Colorado. This film was shipped to theaters as wet prints, which is an industry term meaning that the film reels had just been developed in the lab and the film was barely completed before its release date. William Sadler trained for several months in karate and tai chi to prepare for the ending fight scene in this film. The subplot involving Esperanza being turned over to the US government is a reference to the real-life Panamanian general Manuel Noriega, who was overthrown for brutality and drug trafficking in Panama in the 1980s. All of the airlines featured in the film are fictional. No real airline would agree to be featured in a film depicting terrorist acts at an airport, which is really not shocking at all. And then for IMDb nuggets, obviously this is the dumbest things I could find in the IMDb trivia section for this movie. They say lightning never strikes twice. They were wrong, is the tagline displayed on the UK VHS box for Die Hard 2. The actual saying is that lightning never strikes the same place twice, rendering this statement completely incorrect, which I fucking love. I just picture a fucking basement dwelling individual sitting at his computer, angrily slamming away on his keyboard, typing that out because he was so annoyed that that was not correctly phrased. And it's well, yeah, but if you phrase it correctly, it's not going to work as well. Anywho, on to info and ratings. I'm jumping way a fucking ahead of myself. Opening weekend, 21.7 million. Worldwide gross, 240 million. IMDb rating, 7.2. Letterboxd rating, 3.3. Rotten Tomato critics score, 69%. Rotten Tomato audience score, 70%. Personal rating, 3.5 out of 5 stars. Praise for this movie. I will say that this flick is enjoyable, but it's in the same vein as the Transformers movies, where you basically have to not think too critically about anything that's happening in the plot, or it kind of falls apart for you. The movie certainly delivers on excitement and action throughout, with a lot of well choreographed, intense scenes. And honestly, I don't have any complaints about the acting here. It was all pretty solid. For criticism, I would say fundamentally the worst part about this movie is the writing and sometimes the lack of attention to detail. It was clear to me on this rewatch why this movie is so commonly considered the worst of the first 3 movies, which has a lot to do with it having what I refer to as sequelitis. By that, of course, I mean that it's not only excessively referential to the original film at every turn and largely attempts to adhere to a similar formula, but it's also so determined to try and one-up and escalate the original in every way in terms of action and stakes, and it does it too fucking much. I would also say that our attention as viewers might have been pulled in too many directions a lot of the time, especially early on, and some of the exposition could have been streamlined a bit, and some scenes could have been removed completely that in retrospect were unnecessary to the plot, but it is what it is. All right, everyone, thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
I'm here to welcome you to Brandon and Random Reviews. No method when I choose. It's Brandon and Random Reviews. What you hoped you would see. He's half blind with hats tied, with all the dates every